Hi everybody, this is Joel Toppen here, and this is going to be video number 4 on how to create your own VASSAL modules. In our last video, we created our first game pieces. Now I'm going to show you how to organize those game pieces. If we click on the markers button here up on the toolbar, you'll see that it's got one of the game pieces that we created is visible, but the other piece isn't, and that's because we haven't really organized it. Now, if you put a whole bunch of counters of single pieces in the game piece palette without any organizational tools, they'll generally stack on top of one another. Occasionally you can move something aside up here in the tray and pull a different counter out, but more often than not they're just piled up on top of one another. So here's how we can organize it. I'm going to show you the most simple way to organize these. If we right click on the markers folder, we can choose to add a scrollable list. I know there's pull down menu, but I never use that. I use scrollable list and I use the tabbed panels depending on the types of counters I need to put in a given VASSAL module. So for this one, I'm just going to show you how to do a scrollable list, and we're just going to name this scrollable list General Markers. Click OK. Okay, I've created a scrollable list. I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to take the APs and the drought counters and I'm going to put them in this scrollable list, which means I got to take them out of this folder and put them in this folder. I wish there was drag and drop functionality in VASSAL. It'd be so much easier just to click, drag, drop, but no. What you're going to have to do here, the easiest way to do this is just to do a cut and paste. So if you're using a PC, you'll use a Control X, or on a Mac, a Command X. Or you can use the right-click pop-up menu, but the keyboard shortcut's a lot faster. So I choose to cut the drought counter, and notice it doesn't disappear on me. I'll then left-click on the scrollable list we created, and I'll do a Control V or a Command V to paste. And notice now it disappears from the palette and into the scrollable list. So in the markers palette, we have the markers palette, and then we have the scrollable list under that, and then we have the game pieces in the scrollable list. Let's take the APs counter out as well, using it again, the cut and the paste, and voila, there we have it. Now, if I close the markers panel here on the VASSAL module window and choose to open it up again, you'll see now I have an image of the piece, and then over here is my scrollable list. If I select a counter, there's the image for it, and then of course I can drag and drop it onto the map. So that is probably the simplest way to organize your game pieces that you've created. Now you'll notice that drought is above APs. Once again, in VASSAL, in the editor window, whatever's bottommost tends to be the topmost in a pop-up menu. However, when you're creating game pieces, and this is where it's so counterintuitive to me, whatever's bottommost in the VASSAL module is actually bottommost in the markers scrollable list that we created. So let me explain this a little bit better here. If I go into the properties of the game piece, whatever's bottommost appears topmost in the pop-up menu. But that is not true of the arrangement of the counters. Now, how can I rearrange these? Well, I could do a number of things. I could cut the drought out and then repaste it. The easiest way, though, is just to right-click on the APs counter and choose to move it. And I can choose to move it to the position I want it to be in, and it'll shift everything else downward. So I'm going to choose to put it into section number 1. So it'll be counter number 1 in a list. Click OK, and sure enough, there you have it. It's at the top of the list, and now they're alphabetical in order. Okay, so that is one method of creating some kind of organization for your game pieces. Now here's another way. If you have a lot of counters, this method I just showed you may not be the best way to go about it. So here's another way that you can do this. I'm going to right click on the markers, the game piece folder, and I'm going to choose to add a tabbed panel. Now don't choose to add a panel. What you want to do is choose to add a tabbed panel. Okay, and we're going to call this tab panel. We'll just call it something simple like that. Now we create a tabbed panel. Now we select again the markers folder, the parent folder, right click on it again, or I'm sorry, choose the tabbed panel, right click on it, and we're going to choose to add a panel to the tabbed panel. And we'll call this one panel 1. Okay, now you'll see that there's a little arrow next to the tabbed panel folder, so that we can expand it. And there's our new panel. So the tabbed panel has to be the parent, and the panel needs to be the sibling of that parent. Let's create another panel here. Right click on the tabbed panel, choose to add a panel. We'll call this one panel 2. Click OK. Now let's put some game pieces in here. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to do a cut, the Control X function or Command X function on APs, and I'm going to put it into panel number 1. And I'm going to do a cut on the drought and put that in panel number 2. I'm going to select the general markers, and I'm going to click the delete button on my keyboard, and that removes the tabbed panel entirely. I will now hide the markers on the VASSAL module window. Click it again to re-enable it. And I've got to kind of expand this thing out. Let's see here. Okay, it's not showing the piece in panel 1 properly. It's probably I'm going to need to save and re-enter. But you'll see in panel number 2 my game piece is there. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is I'm going to save. And sometimes, this is the annoying thing about VASSAL, sometimes it doesn't reflect things immediately. So I'm going to save, exit, right click, edit module, we'll reopen it, and it should show everything exactly how we want it to look. Okay, so we're back in, choose markers. There's that little dot thing showing you can grab it and drag it out. I have no idea why this thing will never expand out properly to show all the panels. It's another annoying thing about VASSAL. Anyways, so we expand this thing out, and now we can see both panels in this tabbed panel array that we've created. So panel number 1 shows just one game piece in there. Panel number 2 shows the one game piece in there. Now, if we go into our editor window, we'll expand the markers folder, expand the tabbed panel. We'll expand panel number 1. We're going to copy the APs counter, select the parent folder, and paste it. So now we should have 2 APs counters in panel number 1. And voila, you'll see they sit side by side. If you double click on the panel folder in the editor window, you'll see the properties for it. You can change the name if you want. You can choose to have a vertical layout, which is almost never the way to go, by the way. You almost always want to go horizontal because of the orientation of your average monitor is going to be wider horizontally than vertically. So I almost never use that. If you want to change it to a fixed cell size, you click this checkbox here, and you can select the number of columns, and that can be a way for you to control how many pieces will appear in a row here in the panel. So you'll see if I make the number of columns, let's make it 6. You see it squeeze the pieces together here, making room for 4 more pieces to fit side by side. And if we add any additionals, it would put it in a second row there below it. If they look too squished together, we can always expand it this way. But that's another way that you can organize how the pieces are going to appear in a given panel. That may not be the best option, again, if you have a lot of game pieces. So I'm going to show you yet one more technique. We're going to go ahead and choose to make the panel size here just 2. Actually, you know what? Let's take the fixed cell size off. We'll just disable that. Click OK. All right, let's add a scrollable list to our markers array. I'm going to hide the markers tray there temporarily. Select panel number 1, right-click, add scrollable list, and we'll call this one scroll list. Click OK. Now we need to get those pieces from panel 1 into the scroll list. So I'm just going to do a Control-X, Control-V, Control-X, Control-V, and voila. There we are. So this is the organization. We have the pieces game piece palette. We have a tabbed panel. Within the tabbed panel, we have multiple panels, and within this first panel, we have a scrollable list that also contains pieces. Let's look at how this appears. Click markers on the VASSAL module. Expand this out so you can see everything really good. And look at panel number 2. Do we just have the one piece in there? There's no scrollable list, so just a single game piece appears. In panel number 1, however, when we click that, you'll see there is a scrollable list within that panel. You can actually create three-dimensional arrays of this. You can have, within a panel, you could create a second tabbed panel and more sub-panels to it. It takes some practice doing, but you can indeed create arrays of game pieces. If you have a large module with a lot of game pieces, this may be the ticket. One last thing I need to say about organizing your game pieces, and these are the two methods that I'm going to use in pretty much any module to put my game pieces in. But one thing you need to understand about these game pieces that we've created is that they, whenever you create game pieces in a game piece palette, the module will possess an infinite number of those game pieces. In other words, if I open this module, new game, and here's our map, I'll scroll down and I just start dragging these counters on the map. I can do this all day long. Okay, this module will produce a game piece every time I drag a game piece out. Now, ordinarily that's not going to be a problem, but in modules where you have a single game piece and you don't want any duplicates of that game piece ever being created, then this particular implementation will be an issue for you. So you need to be aware of that. There is another way to create game pieces, in which case you have only a single piece, and you can't create duplicates of it. And in our next video, I'm going to show you how to do that. So these are the markers trays. I'm going to say one more thing about the marker tray, and that is you can have more than one marker tray. If I click on the main folder for our module, the topmost folder, if I right-click on that, I can choose to add a game piece palette. It's the second from the top. Let's add a second game piece palette, and I'll call this one Other Pieces. Okay. All right. Now I'm just going to borrow some stuff. I'm going to borrow the game piece from palette number 2, from panel number 2 in the first game palette. So I selected markers, expanded it out. I find that drought counter, choose to copy it to the clipboard. Then I go over to Other Piece, and I'm just going to paste it in there. Now, here's what's going to happen. Whenever we show the markers tray, it's embedded into the top portion of the VASSAL module window. So when you're playing, you click markers, it's always going to appear up here. You can't drag it away. You can't undock it, if you will, from the toolbar. It's an integral part of the toolbar. However, with the second game piece palette that we created, if I open that, a little window pops up and I have to kind of expand this thing. So here's what I'm saying. If you create additional game piece palettes, they will not dock to the toolbar. They will actually appear as pop-up windows that you'll have to manually resize, and a lot of times this is kind of a clumsy tool. I prefer not to use this in my modules. You may find it helpful for you, but more often than not, I find this kind of a clumsy implementation. However, the option is available to you to create multiple palettes, and but just remember that beyond any palette beyond the first palette in the module will be a floating palette that you're going to have to remember. It'll end up behind your main window. See if I guess it can't. I think in previous versions you could lose it. If you clicked like the window, it would appear behind it. So I guess it won't do that anymore. Again, I don't use this function that often, but it's a floating panel, and sometimes it's going to get in the way. You can make it disappear and appear by clicking the toolbar button, and once you've sized it, it's going to maintain that size as long as you have the module open. But more often than not, this isn't really the best way to go about putting pieces in a module. I prefer to use one palette. And if you have a lot of pieces, that's where your tabbed panel is going to work, and you can use, like I said, two-dimensional, three-dimensional arrays. You can do a lot with the tabbed panels. Just remember, you can put a scrollable list inside a panel. Alright, so I hope this was helpful. In our next video, I'll show you some more things about game pieces. We'll look at how to create game pieces that where there's not an infinite number of them, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about game piece prototypes.